Frequency Podcast Network. Stories that matter, podcasts that resonate.
A few weeks ago, a listener named Tova sent us an email.
Why aren't there physical stores for middle-class people to buy clothes? Gap, Old Navy, H&M, Victoria's Secret, even the Children's Place, they're all closing locations. And other previously affordable places like Roots and Banana Republic, they've all become high-end with prices like over $100 for a sweater. You can order online, but you can't see the size. Shipping back is too much of a hassle. And it takes so long to be refunded. Plus, they're starting to charge for returns. When I go to Yorkdale, there are honestly more stores to buy an electric car than places where I can buy affordable clothes for my kids. So maybe the bigger question is, are bricks and mortar stores just for rich people now?
I'm Jordan Heath Rawlings. That was Tova. You're listening to In This Economy, where we help you understand the systems that create your money problems. From grocery bills to buying new clothes and everything in between. In every episode, we hear from a listener who is facing a financial challenge, and then I'll talk to an expert who can explain the factors causing that problem and offer, if not perfect, solutions, then pivots or options and things you can do, even in this economy. Now, in this episode, we're using our listener's question more as a jumping off point. So apologies in advance, Tova, if we don't exactly answer your question about bricks and mortar clothing stores, but there's a really interesting question behind it. Do we need to reframe how we think about buying clothes in this economy? For a bit more context around the real cost of clothing, we called Kelly Drennan. She is the founder of Fashion Takes Action, a nonprofit organization that's devoted to advancing sustainability in the fashion industry.
I guess if we're going to talk about the true cost of our clothes, then you have to factor in its impact on people and planet. So, for example, a sustainably made garment is going to cost more money because not only were the materials used to make the garment better for the planet, but the people who made the garment were also paid a fair living wage. And conventional fashion or fast fashion doesn't represent the true cost. So there is no way that a garment that costs less than $20, even actually $30, there's no way that that was made sustainably or that the people who made it were paid a decent wage. So many people don't realize that our clothes are actually made by human beings. They somehow think robots are doing all of the sewing, but that's really not the case. In fact, there's about 75 million people around the world making the 100 billion new garments every single year. And about 75% of them are women.
This is all really good information. It kind of sets the baseline for what we want to talk about today, which is for sure, how to purchase sustainable clothing, but also mostly how not to get caught up in the endless cycle of fast fashion. And maybe you can explain a little bit about the costs of that in the long run, because I know when you're surfing Instagram or whatever, shoot, a $6 top looks really good, but it doesn't always end up that way.
Well, that's exactly the case, right? So also on the topic of people then, there's a true cost or an impact that garment manufacturing has on human health. So from the cotton farms to the leather tanneries, fashion is using some of the most toxic and carcinogenic chemicals. And the levels of exposure by garment workers is really high. That and the wastewater is typically not treated and it's dumped into nearby rivers, polluting the only freshwater source for those who live nearby. So for drinking, for bathing, and to grow their food. And then when you're talking about the cost of that garment, that $6 top you mentioned or garment that you mentioned, what price is the planet paying for us to look and feel good? And I say feel good because, let's face it, there is something psychological about why we shop and how it makes us feel. So not only are wages part of the hidden cost of our clothes, but so is deforestation, water pollution, biodiversity loss, and ultimately climate change. And just to throw some numbers at you, a single pair of jeans uses about 1,800 gallons of water to make from start to finish, or 700 gallons for a single cotton t-shirt. And that same t-shirt on average was made in up to 7 different countries, traveling about 25,000 kilometers before it lands on your back. So that's like driving across Canada 5 times, right? So there's a lot that goes into what we're paying when we buy our clothes and the things that we don't think about, or as I call them, the hidden costs.
These problems can seem pretty intractable given the past few years. What are the biggest challenges or the challenge that gets in the way of turning it around?
Well, there isn't really just one challenge facing the fashion industry. As I've alluded to, it's a very complex set of problems for a very complex industry that relies on a global and fragmented supply chain to produce its goods. So, from that perspective, traceability, I would say, is the greatest challenge for brands to overcome because they have little to no visibility of said supply chain. So, transparency is a term we often hear, which means, companies, not just fashion, disclose more details about how and where their products are being made. There's even in fashion, there's Fashion Revolution's annual transparency index that ranks 250 of the world's largest brands on how much information they're disclosing. And in their 2023 report, the average score of all of those brands was simply 26%, surprisingly up, but only by 2% from the previous year.
Huh.
Only 2 brands out of 250 scored higher than 80%, and that's for the very first time. And then 70 brands still scored below 10%. So huge problem. But if you think of transparency as showing and then traceability as knowing, you first have to know your supply chain before you can show it. Right. And because these supply chains are massive, there's 4 tiers actually for them to know. Most brands, they're starting to disclose their tier 1 suppliers, which is really the cut and sew facilities. But most of them do not have visibility beyond that, which means all the way back to tier 4, which is, say, what farm the cotton was grown on. So this traceability piece is one of the biggest challenges that the industry is facing today. And then I think after that, we have climate. 80 to 90% of the carbon footprint of our clothes happens at the manufacturing level. And of course, given that most of our clothes are made in developing countries, this creates a number of challenges. So who pays for the factories to transition away from fossil fuels and towards renewables when factories are manufacturing for all kinds of different brands, right? And then how can Canada care more about these emissions, which, by the way, are between 5 to 8% of all global greenhouse gas emissions, which doesn't sound like a lot, but it's actually more than all of aviation, shipping, and rail combined. Right. So everybody always like points fingers at flying, right? But actually, the fashion industry is more than that. So, how can the Canadian government and businesses and citizens care more about this issue when it's happening somewhere else and not in our own backyard? So, this is another challenge. Reducing emissions and setting science-based targets are now becoming a priority for many brands, but sadly, not enough of them care. And there's this new sort of category of ultra fast fashion brands like Shein, who put out 10,000 new styles every single day,
Right.
right?
Yeah.
So other fast fashion brands like Zara, H&M, they put out 100 new styles every week. So just by comparison, 10,000 a day. So it can feel a little bit discouraging and sometimes downright depressing, really, when it comes to this overall progress. And then the last thing, and this is where I think we have more control, is waste, right? So the waste that the industry is producing, and while manufacturing happens overseas, our clothes do end up in our backyard, in our landfills. Like according to the Ellen MacArthur Foundation, the equivalent of a garbage truck full of clothes is either landfilled or incinerated every second of every day. So the industry has to solve for this by, you guessed it, making less, but really also adopting more circular business models like repair and rental and resale, and investing in the technology to recycle unusable clothes into new textiles, right? So there's a lot going on. And those, I would say, are sort of the biggest 3 that stand out to me right now. And those are also where the brands are at in terms of prioritizing.
Wow. So there's a lot to think about when it comes to what we wear, and it seems clear that we need to reframe our thinking around clothing consumption entirely. But before we get to that, I want to bring it back to the average person who we're assuming here does care about the impacts you've been talking about, but listen, also cares about just affording things. What do we know about how much the average Canadian spends on clothing in a year, and where's that trending?
Well, according to Stats Canada, in 2021, the average household spent about $2,300 annually on clothing. And that's, due to COVID, was down by 31% from 2019. So if we look at pre-pandemic, the average household spent about $3,000 a year on clothes. What's more interesting is the number of garments that equates to.
Right.
So, 20 years ago, our clothes actually cost more than they do today. Unlike food and gasoline prices, which have steadily risen, reaching really an all-time peak in recent months, our clothes today in this economy that we live in right now cost less.
Right.
So if the average t-shirt in 2002 cost $15, today it costs only $10.
Why is that?
Yeah, well, so first of all, inflation in fashion is far below all other items at just 0.7% in 2023 from the year before, compared to 3.4% for all other items during that same period. And then you have a few brands like, say, Lululemon, who are the exception to the rule because they've been able to increase their prices steadily, given their massive fan base, which has grown especially outside of Canada. So coming back to that, it's less about how much Canadians are spending on clothes and more about how many items of clothing they're getting. And so how did we get there, I think is what you're asking. It's a race to the bottom line, really. And when our manufacturing moved to the global south, the cost to produce clothes dropped significantly. And ever since then, it's just got faster and cheaper to the point where the industry overproduces, but we also overconsume. So if 20 years ago, $50 would get you 2 items of clothing, today you can get 7 or 8 items for that same amount.
Right.
Yeah, and it didn't happen overnight. Like we didn't just wake up one day and see that $100 jeans now cost $30. But over time, the prices have plummeted, and so has our willingness to invest in our wardrobe. That is a big part of the problem. We need a mindset shift away from this level of consumption because there's no way we can buy ourselves out of the climate crisis. And then equally, the industry has to slow down, as do we.
When you talk about those 7 items of clothing you can get for $50, how often do those clothes get worn on average?
Well, alarmingly, the average garment is only worn 7 times.
Really?
Yeah.
And that's the average. So some of them are coming in at like 2 or 3.
Yeah, or 0. So I was about to say, like when we did our waste audit, we audited 10 different municipalities across Ontario over the course of a year. We found garments in there with the tags still on them. In the landfill, in the waste stream, people just throwing them out. So they've never even worn them, right? So that's how we get to that 7. And I know it's shocking because a lot of people I talk to, they're like, but I wear my stuff like for 30 or 40 or 50 times. But no, there is a lot of people out there who really don't.
And the other option, I guess, to your point, is investing in quality clothes that are made to last, that you'll wear more than 7 times at the very least. Well, this is where our listener comes in and they want to know, like, where do you do that now? To their point, the middle class stores like Gap and Old Navy and those places are all closing their locations. And other stores like Roots and Banana Republic have become high end. And I assume that's because of sustainability practices, but I don't know. I don't know where their clothes are made, to be honest. So I guess I'm asking is what can the average person who is concerned with the impact of their clothing, but also just wants their clothing to last, do to afford those kind of pieces on a budget?
Yeah, I mean, it's a great question. And really, thrifting is the ideal way to really be more sustainable when you're on a budget, especially if you have kids that you need to clothe. They grow so quickly, and most used clothing for kids has been barely worn. And there's lots of local thrift stores like brick and mortar, charity and thrift stores, but there's also a lot of online marketplaces and apps that can also offer this as well. But even buying thrift for adults is a great option. 90% of what I own is thrifted, and my daughters, who are now young adults, are also really into this, and they join with their friends, and it's a whole outing, right? But it's really important, I think, for us to remember that the most sustainable garment is the one already in your closet. So when people do feel the need or the impulse that, we all feel to go out sometimes and buy something new, it's important to really see what you already own, or as we like to call it, shop your closet. Like that's the most affordable because chances are you've got something similar that you completely forgot about. You asked about, how many times the average garment's worn, but what's also interesting is we wear 20% of our wardrobe 80% of the time.
Hmm.
So there's 80% of our clothes that just want to be worn and loved, right? So it's like get reacquainted with them. Remember why you bought them in the first place. Maybe you just need to style it a little differently. Or if you're handy, you can maybe give it a slight alteration. Or you could find someone in your community, I'm sure, who could do that alteration for you. So that's really the most important thing that we really need to be doing in terms of even reframing how we think about buying clothes, not just about what's affordable.
Those are really good suggestions. And I imagine for a lot of people my age or your age with, wardrobes that they've established, they might work fairly well. I also imagine anybody listening to that with children right now is like, yeah, but they grow out of it like in 2 months or in 6 months, or it gets dirty and torn up and wrecked. And like when I think about as a parent making the cost benefit analysis around fast fashion, that's the only place where I see the benefit outweighing the costs, is because especially today, you can't afford to spend $30 or $40 on something for a kid that is going to grow out of it in 3 months or wreck it, right? Like that's why people buy $6 onesies.
Yeah. Or go to Value Village and you can probably find them for $3.
Right.
And they've been, barely worn. Right. So that's the option. I mean, I'd say 90% of my kids' clothes, at least everything that I bought them, was thrifted. I know my mother did not love the fact that I asked her to only buy used clothes for my kids, but she embraced it. Eventually, she got over it.
Right.
I think she snuck in the odd, new pair of pajamas or something, but but she would, enjoy going out to yard sales and finding all these clothes, and she could get a whole bag of stuff for $5, and it's in great condition. So lots of options, I think, especially when it comes to kids' clothing. But we really also need to take better care of our clothes, and a lot of it comes down to, I talked about that idea of investment, and you've mentioned it too, like how much we invested in our wardrobe. Like the more expensive an item is, the better the chances are that we're going to take good care of it, right? You won't wash it after every single wear.
That's very true.
Yeah,
you'll follow the actual instructions on the tag instead of just tossing it in and hoping for the best and buying a new one if it screws up.
Exactly. And then if you do wash it, like if it does get dirty or smelly, like you wash it in cold water and you hang it to dry and all of those things, right? So we do need to care for all of our clothes, though, equally, not even just the stuff that we actually spent the money on, because the more we love our clothes, the longer they're going to last. So that really kind of ties into this whole idea of like overconsumption and how do we contribute to the reduction of that.
That makes a lot of sense. I think the one thing that we should discuss that I think we're still missing here is what did happen to the middle class of clothes, right? Now everything, it does seem, aside from used clothing and thrifting, but everything it does seem is either scrambling to be as cheap as possible and disposable as possible, or is the kind of investment that, yeah, you might make once or twice a year, but is also, unattainable for a lot of people in this economy. Where did the clothes in the middle go? Like, what happened to them?
Yeah, the middle class clothes. Yeah, I mean, so the industry's facing so many challenges right now. And trying to fix this mess that we're in is not cheap. And it's not something that can be done overnight. And so, it could be, I don't have the answer for you, but it could be that it is a lot of efforts being put into trying to address some of these challenges that they are facing. And as a result, we're seeing a bit more price increases. But as I said, under 1% inflation in fashion. So it's really not happening at the same level. I think let's talk about food, or gasoline. Like, I mean, those are areas where we're for sure seeing the prices are rising. But again, if you compare it to clothing purchased pre 2002, it's still cheaper today than it was back then. So, I think it really comes down to this mindset shift and awareness. And the more you know about how our clothes are made and by whom, the more you start to appreciate, I think, the true cost. And something that is $60 or $80, you might actually start realizing like, oh, there was a human being behind this garment sitting at a sewing machine, sewing on all of these pieces, the fabric used might be organic or, from sustainably sourced materials like Tencel or something. So these are all things that we need to start thinking about and getting better at reading labels, looking for the different types of fabrics, looking for certifications, because greenwashing is a problem in this industry. There's a lot of misleading claims out there. Yeah. So it's unfortunate. It takes a lot of work for us. It's a lot of time and effort that we need to invest in how we're buying our clothes. But until we see more laws in place, this is just the way it's going to be.
Lastly, give us some tips on shifting that mindset. Because, listen, I think we all know the allure of you've got a trip coming up, or you've got a big night out, or it's your birthday and you're going to be going to a party or whatever. And it feels good to get some new clothes that you can afford, that you can look great in, even if it's just for a night. And at that point, it can be tough to think all the way down the chain like that. How do you shift that mindset? Because it's really been ingrained into us.
Oh, yeah. And I mean, I guess scientific proof too, right? There's like a dopamine hit that you get when you buy something new, like
Yeah.
retail therapy.
I mean, that's retail therapy, right?
Yeah.
It's a proven actual. Yeah.
Yeah. So, we came up with something called the 7 R's of fashion. And it really kind of ties in with this whole idea of the circular economy with our clothing. And most people know the 3R waste hierarchy of reduce, reuse, recycle. So we've introduced a few more, which are repair, repurpose, rental, and resale. So with recycling still as the last resort, because really when our clothes are so used and worn out, only then, or damaged beyond repair, only then should they be considered for recycling. And so, as I mentioned before, reduce is the number one thing. We have to slow down and buy less, shop your closet. Then we need to actually start looking into reuse. And so, reuse is probably my favorite of all of the R's because that's where you get into the thrifting and secondhand, but you also can participate in clothing swaps. So, there's lots of different groups that are organizing community swaps, but you can also do one with your friends. I'm part of a book club. And one night we ended up just deciding one month to do a clothing swap instead of reading a book. So, 12 women got together and each of us brought 2 to 5 pieces of clothing that were just sitting in our closets collecting dust, and we swapped them, right? So I think there's just also sort of this misunderstanding really around swaps, and that people think it's all just garbage. It's stuff that's torn or damaged or stained. But no, like we all have pieces in our closets that we don't wear. And so why not swap them? That's the most affordable really thing that you can be doing. And then like we already talked about, if you're going to buy something new, one of the things that we like is this tool called cost per wear, right? So look for how well it was made, how trendy it is. So if it's like a $10 top that's super trendy, whether it's like the color, let's say fluorescent green, or the style is super trendy, ask yourself how many times you're going to wear it, and then check to see how well it was made, because you can really, if you do spend that time, it's hard online because you don't get to touch and feel a garment, and more of us are buying things online. So it's really difficult. But if you have the luxury of being there to touch the garment, you can check seams. You can look at the buttons and the zippers with the button sewn on properly. Is the zipper super cheap and it's going to break and fall off? Like these are things that you need to think about and factor into how many times you're going to wear it. And then maybe there's that same top, a $50 version that's made from certified organic cotton, and it's a classic seasonless piece that's not going to be off trend in 3 months, and that's well made. And how many times are you going to wear that? And then do the math, right? It's an interesting experiment. And then getting back to the R's, one-off occasions, I love the fact that there's rental now. So if you have a wedding or graduation or prom or something like that, where you would typically just buy something and wear it once, now you can actually get these designer pieces at a fraction of the cost. And you're now a part of the sharing economy, right? So that mindset shift also includes like ownership, right? Like, why do we need to own our clothes? Could we look at sharing? And this is where rental comes in.
Kelly, thank you so much for this. Really fascinating.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me.
Kelly Drennan is the founder of Fashion Takes Action. That's a nonprofit organization devoted to advancing sustainability in the fashion industry. For more information about their activities, you can visit fashiontakesaction.com. Thanks to Kelly for sharing her expertise with us, and of course, thanks to Tova for writing in with the initial question. I know it was probably not the answer you were expecting, but I hope it's given you some ideas about how to afford clothes for sure, but also how to afford sustainable clothes that will last. If you, like Tova, have a money problem or even just a question about this economy, we want to hear from you. You can email us at hello@itepod.ca, or you can call us and just talk about it with a voicemail. The way to do that is by dialing 416-935-5935. Say whatever you want, but if you want to be on this show, you got to leave us a number to call you back. It would also be helpful if you actually had the numbers that relate to your financial problem. Thank you all so much for listening to this show, and if you like this show and want us to continue making it, you got to let us know. You also got to share it. You got to rate it, review it, whatever it is that your podcast player lets you do. We appreciate it when you do it. I'm your host and executive producer, Jordan Heath Rawlings. This episode was written and produced by Allison Broverman and Stephanie Phillips. The sound design was done by Christy Chan. Mary Jubrin is our digital editor. Diana Kay is our manager of business development. Together, we make up the Frequency Podcast Network, which is a division of Rogers. Thanks once again for listening. We will talk next week on In This Economy.